Well, are you coming now or later?" "Are you going already?" he cried, his face full of reproach. "Already? It is past 4, I know." "What are you going already for?" he lamented. "You needn't come if you don't want," she said. And she went slowly away with her little girl, whilst her son stood watching her, cut to the heart to let her go, and yet unable to leave the Wakes. As she crossed the open ground in front of the Moon and Stars, she heard men shouting, and smelled the beer, and hurried a little, thinking her husband was probably in the bar. At about 6:30 her son came home, tired now, rather pale, and somewhat wretched. He was miserable, though he did not know it, because he had let her go alone. Since she had gone, he had not enjoyed his Wakes. "Has my dad been?" he asked. "No," said the mother. "He's helping to wait at the Moon and Stars. I seed him through that black tin stuff with holes in it, on the window, with his sleeves rolled up." "Ha!" exclaimed the mother shortly. "He's got no money, and he'll be satisfied if he gets his allowance, whether they give him more or not." When the light was fading, and Mrs. Morel could see no more to sew, she rose and went to the door. Everywhere was the sound of excitement, the restlessness of the holiday, that at last infected her. She went out into the side garden. Women were coming home from the Wakes, the children hugging a white lamb with green legs, or a wooden horse. Occasionally a man lurched past, almost as full as he could carry. Sometimes a good husband came along with his family, peacefully. But usually the women and children were alone. The stay-at-home mothers stood gossiping at the corners of the alley, as the twilight sank, folding their arms under their white aprons. Mrs. Morel was alone, but she was used to it. Her son and her little girl slept upstairs, so, it seemed, her home was there behind her, fixed and stable. But she felt wretched with the coming child. The world seemed a dreary place, where nothing else would happen for her, at least until William grew up. But for herself, nothing but this dreary endurance, till the children grew up. And the children! She could not afford to have this third. She did not want it. The father was serving beer in a public-house, swilling himself drunk. She despised him, and was tied to him. This coming child was too much for her. If it was not for William and Annie, she was sick of it, the struggle with poverty and ugliness and meanness. She went into the front garden, feeling too heavy to take herself out, yet unable to stay indoors. The heat suffocated her, and looking ahead, the prospect of her life made her feel as if she were buried alive. The front garden was a small square with a privet hedge. There she stood, trying to soothe herself with the scent of flowers and the fading, beautiful evening. Opposite her small gate was the stile that led uphill, under the tall hedge between the burning glow of the cut pastures. The sky overhead throbbed and pulsed with light. The glow sank quickly off the field. The earth and the hedges smoked dusk. As it grew dark, a ruddy glare came out on the hilltop, and out of the glare the diminished commotion of the fair. Sometimes, down the trough of darkness formed by the path under the hedges, men came lurching home. One young man lapsed into a run down the steep bit that ended the hill, and went with a crash into the stile. Mrs. Morel shuddered. He picked himself up, swearing viciously, rather pathetically, as if he thought the stile had wanted to hurt him. She went indoors, wondering if things were ever going to alter. She was beginning by now to realize that they would not. She seemed so far away from her girlhood, she wondered if it were the same person walking heavily up the back garden at the Bottoms, as had run so lightly up the breakwater at Sheerness 10 years before. "What have I to do with it?" she said to herself. "What have I to do with all this? Even the child I'm going to have. It doesn't seem as if I were taken into account." Sometimes life takes hold of one, carries the body along, accomplishes one's history, and yet is not real, but leaves oneself, as it were, slurred over. "I wait," Mrs. Morel said to herself. "I wait, and what I wait for can never come." Then she straightened the kitchen, lit the lamp, mended the fire, looked out the washing for the next day, and put it to soak. After which she sat down to her sewing. Through the long hours her needle flashed regularly through the stuff. Occasionally she sighed, moving to relieve herself, and all the time she was thinking how to make the most of what she had for the children's sakes. At 11:30 her husband came. His cheeks were very red and very shiny above his black moustache. His head nodded slightly. He was pleased with himself. Waitin' for me, lass? I've been helpin' Anthony. And what's think he gi'n me? Nowt but a lousy £1/2, and that's ivery penny." "He thinks you've made the rest up in beer," she said shortly. "And I haven't. That I haven't. You believe me, I've had very little this day. I haven't all." His voice went tender. "Here, and I brought thee a bit of brandy snap, and a cocoanut for the children." He laid the gingerbread and the cocoanut, a hairy object, on the table. "Nay, tha never said thank you for nowt in thy life, did there?" As a compromise, she picked up the cocoanut and shook it to see if it had any milk. "It's a good un. You may back your life for that. I got it for Bill Hodgkinson. 'Bill,' I says, 'thou done wants them 3 nuts, dost her? Are in it to forgive me one for my bit of a lad and wench?' 'I am, Walter, my lad,' he says. 'Take which on 'em's ter mind.' And so I took one, and thanked him. I didn't like to shake it afore his eyes, but he says, 'Tha'd better make sure it's a good un, Walt.' And so, you see, I knowed it was. He's a fine chap, is Bill Hodgkinson. He's a nice chap." "A man will part with anything so long as he's drunk, and you're drunk along with him," said Mrs. Morel. "Eh, that mucky little hussy, who's drunk, I should like to know?" said Morel. He was extraordinarily pleased with himself because of his day's helping to wait in the Moon and Stars. He chattered on. Mrs. Morel, very tired, and sick of his babble, went to bed as quickly as possible, while he raked the fire. Mrs. Morel came of a good old burgher family, famous independents who had fought with Colonel Hutchinson, and who remained stout Congregationalists. Her grandfather had gone bankrupt in the lace market, at a time when so many lace manufacturers were ruined in Nottingham. Her father, George Coppard, was an engineer, a large, handsome, haughty man, proud of his fair skin and blue eyes, but more proud still of his integrity. Gertrude resembled her mother in her small build, but her temper, proud and unyielding, she had from the Coppards. George Coppard was bitterly galled by his own poverty. He became foreman of the engineers in the dockyard at Sheerness. Mrs. Morel, Gertrude, was the second daughter. She favoured her mother, loved her mother best of all, but she had the Coppards' clear, defiant blue eyes and their broad brow. She remembered to have hated her father's overbearing manner towards her gentle, humorous, kindly-souled mother. She remembered running over the breakwater at Sheerness and finding the boat. She remembered to have been petted and flattered by all the men when she had gone to the dockyard, for she was a delicate, rather proud child. She remembered the funny old mistress, whose assistant she had become, whom she had loved to help in the private school, and she still had the Bible that John Field had given her. She used to walk home from chapel with John Field when she was 19. He was the son of a well-to-do tradesman, had been to college in London, and was to devote himself to business. She could always recall in detail a September Sunday afternoon, when they had sat under the vine at the back of her father's house. The sun came through the chinks of the vine leaves and made beautiful patterns, like a lace scarf, falling on her and on him. Some of the leaves were clean yellow, like yellow flat flowers. "Now sit still," he had cried. How your hair, I don't know what it is like. It's as bright as